Hello, Harston. So you might not know that before I went into language teaching, I used to work in computing. In fact, my first degree was in computer science. So, if I'm into languages and I'm into computers, I must love Google Translate, right? Well, yes, as long as you use it right. Because you see, what most people do not appreciate is that Google Translate and software like it is designed for reading, not for writing. The idea is that when I, as a reader, cannot understand a text in another language, I can turn it into my own language. It doesn't matter that the language it produces is kind of mangled and unnatural, because I can decode it, because it makes more sense to me than the original. However, online, in comments to some of my YouTube videos and in posts on Facebook, I frequently come across stuff that has been written in Google Translate. So that means that somebody has taken a language that I, as a reader, do know and can understand perfectly, and generated text in a language that I also know, but not as well as English, and is therefore harder for me to understand. But also, the translation isn't right. It can be at times very, very wrong. And so it's harder for me to understand what's being said. Now, if I had the original, I would know what was being said. But with the Google Translate version, I have to spend a while working it out. And what is gained from that? You're not practicing your Gaelic if somebody else has written the Gaelic. And I'm not practicing my Gaelic if I'm reading something that isn't really Gaelic. A few years ago, I was at a barbecue that a neighbour was holding one summer. And she said to me, "Neil, you speak Spanish, don't you? Could I ask you a favour?" I said, "Of course." Now, as it turned out, she'd received an email, a very strange email, about a holiday flat she'd booked in Western Spain. The email was mostly English, but it had a handful of Spanish words peppered through it. When I saw the email, I worked out what had happened. The words were at the end of every sentence and the start of the next sentence, because the woman who had written the email in Spanish hadn't left a space after her full stops. Google Translate therefore did not know that that was two separate words. Google Translate thought it may have been a website address or maybe a trademark, and therefore something that shouldn't be translated. Now, I could work out what was intended by that email because I could work out what those individual words meant and reconstruct the sentences in English around them. However, if I had not been fluent in Spanish, I wouldn't have been able to understand at all. If instead the email had come through in Spanish and I had seen it as a non-Spanish speaker, I might have worked out just the same that the problem was the lack of spaces. I could have added in the spaces, and then I could have got the correct translation, or at least a translation that was good enough to understand. And that's why Google Translate has to be left to the reader, because it loses information and the reader has to be able to go back and find a way to regain that information. Google Translate in Gaelic is particularly bad. One of the reasons for this is because Google Translate has been trained with a very small set of data. And the less data you have, the less accurate the translation will be. In particular, Gaelic in Google Translate has a massive problem with apostrophes. Apostrophes that should be at the end of one word are often put at the start of the next. And I've often puzzled as to why it could do that. I've come to the conclusion that it's probably because they trained Google Translate's Gaelic model on text coming out of PDFs. I don't know if you've ever tried to copy text from a PDF, but it can be a nightmare. The spacing and the layout goes all wrong. The most likely source for, or well, not even the most likely, but definitely the most common source for Google Translate's input will be publications by the Scottish Government. And those publications will often be in a PDF format. So when they've copied the text out of the PDF, spaces have gone in where they shouldn't be, spaces have disappeared from where they should, and at some point, clearly, apostrophes have been orphaned from the words they're with. And somewhere along the line, someone has intervened and tried to put the apostrophes in the right place, and they have quite simply failed. To the point where Google Translate will put the majority of apostrophes in the wrong place. So not only will using Google Translate to translate to Gaelic make it harder for the person who's reading your message, it will also present to you mistakes. And if that becomes your training data, then your model of the Gaelic language will be wrong. So I have to say, please, 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 never translate into Scottish Gaelic using Google Translate. Cheers and drasta.